7 The Days Long Gone is at first glance an unassuming game. It has a silly name, but it otherwise looks like a solid CRPG. Behind its simple facade are its developers, IMGN.PRO, responsible for the excellent horror game Collant, and Fool's Theory, a new company mostly made up of former CD Projekt Red vets. You may better know them as the folks behind the Witcher series. Don't let this pedigree fool you though. 7 comes nowhere near The Witcher in terms of being either a seminal work of art or as a game, no matter how hard it tries.
And when the dust settled, nothing remained but ash and bones. The children of war were left to fight over the spoils of the fallen cities to survive.
7 sets itself up as a sci-fi dystopian thriller, but also as a grim post-apocalyptic story of survival. It's a good idea, reminiscent of Horizon Zero Dawn from earlier this year. There's a destructive force that wiped out most of humanity, in this case it's the generic demons, and those that remained form little civilizations throughout the world, using futuristic technology to cut back this scourge. Eventually, one man arose and promised to take the remnants of humanity to a new world beyond the stars. Cinematics don't convey this story, and certainly not the gameplay. Instead, it's spat out at you via a lengthy PowerPoint presentation. It goes deep into politics and world building, throwing several vague terms at you without letting you stop and examine what the world has become or why you should care. After this ends, you're dumped into the shoes of Teriel, a thief and former member of the Thieves Guild, before getting kicked out for being too much of a rebel. I half expected Teriel's friend at the start of the game to unironically call him a loose cannon, yelling at him with a red face and a cigar sticking out of his mouth. This is a cliché-heavy story, using every well-trodden science fiction trope it can think of. We never learn much about Teriel, as the game is more interested in world building than character development. What we do learn of him is that he's a thief, and he has no interest in politics, or much of anything but himself, and he likes money. All the other characters you run into are much the same way, all stereotypes cut from the same cloth, unlikable assholes. But the clichés don't end there. The game makes a big deal about how you're a thief and how Teriel is a tough guy who doesn't play by the rules, but then it immediately pulls the bungled job that was actually a setup by a powerful figure as a test all along trope. From there, you can also see the plot go down the sci-fi dystopian trope checklist as you're saddled with a partner you don't like, given an overly elaborate mission that goes wrong at every turn, and you're just kinda sitting there for the ride. A cliched story could still be great if presented well. There's nothing remotely original about The Last of Us, but it's regarded as one of the best written games ever made. Even other games of this genre are great examples, like Deus Ex or the recent Pillars of Eternity. But 7 The Long Gone Days is a hackneyed bore that tries to emulate the greats of the genre and comes up empty precisely because it has nothing new or even interesting to say for itself. It doesn't help that a lot of the story comprises of nonsensical terminology and concepts you'd expect from a high fantasy game. The techno-magi control the prison island of Peh in the world of Vendrel, and a demon lives in your head called Artanak, and there's the tech rot that you need to watch out for, but the biggest threat are the tinnies. It's hard to understand what people are talking about, as none of the lore behind these concepts ever gets any explanation. 7 simply assumes you'll understand what all these are and how they relate to one another. This is the kind of writing that's often confused for brilliant subtlety in world building, but none of it means anything. It's just lazy attempts at making the world feel grander than it actually is. 7 is also desperate to be dark and edgy, putting no thought into how to make that work, again, almost as if they were copying other games in the genre. Teriel is your standard tough guy, uncaring protagonist, but he never warms up or becomes more interesting. Every character you meet in the game is a terrible person. There's a disease killing people that everyone's talking about, but nobody seems to be doing anything about. Senseless crime is committed in the streets, and the guards in the prison don't seem to care. If they're going to go the route of guards not caring about what the criminals do, then why even have them there? Surely that's the point of putting this prison on an island, right? Speaking of which, early on you'll run into a slave auction. Again, Peh is a prison, so who are these slaves? Where did they come from, and who's buying them? Are the slaves other prisoners? Is it the other prisoners buying these slaves? Are the slave masters also prisoners, or are they from regular society? Why are slaves being sold in a prison to prisoners and not to societal elites? Do the guards not care? Why does the society care so much about crime that they have public executions and had to dedicate an entire island to being a prison, and yet don't mind slave auctions happening in the open? It reeks of a narrative that had no thought put into how its various elements fit together, or whether or not they even do fit. 7, The Long Gone Days, even down to its title, feels like a game that is trying above all else to be mature without knowing how to actually be mature. One way 7 seeks to differentiate itself is through its gameplay. Rather than being a traditional turn-based CRPG, it is instead a real-time stealth free-roaming RPG. You play as a thief, so it makes sense that stealth and parkour would play a big role in the gameplay. It's clear the developers stopped there and thought the concept alone would carry the day. The stealth mechanics don't seem to work most of the time. You can hide in bushes and behind objects, but there's no sticking to cover like you'd find in Metal Gear, or hiding in the shadows like in Splinter Cell. Because of this, you're never certain if what you're hiding behind works as cover or not. Sometimes it does, sometimes it just doesn't. And it's bizarrely difficult to get into stealth mode in this supposed stealth game. You have to press a button to crouch, which is the only way you can sneak, and you automatically exit out of that crouch whenever you climb up something, jump, initiate a stealth kill, or when interacting with certain objects. Often you'll get spotted because Teriel decided he just didn't particularly feel like crouching sometimes. 7 uses a top-down camera. You spin the camera around on its axis and zoom in and out, but you can't change the angle itself. This makes it impossible to see the faster-moving enemies. To counter this though, enemy AI is generally awful. They have such low perception that you can get surprisingly close to them before they see you, and can get up close behind them as quickly as you like and take them out before they ever think about turning around. In almost every instance, it's easier and quicker to run around and not bother sneaking. As a result, you'll often find that stealth has no middle ground. You're either 100% hidden, or you're spotted. There isn't much of a caution phase where enemies are suspicious or are searching the area for you. Once you do get spotted, it is far too easy to run away, lose your pursuers, and they'll just go right back to the regular patrol patterns. Not that it matters much anyway, because if you do somehow screw up, you can save and load at any time, making this stealth totally inconsequential anyway. If you are detected, there is combat. It's not generally recommended, partly because you're not much of a fighter, and partly because the combat is dull at best, and an untenable disaster at worst. You can clear out the most basic enemies by using your standard attack and gear you find at the beginning of the game, assuming you can get a bead on anybody. You can lock onto targets, but most of the time they'll dodge at the last second and you'll just miss, so both you and your enemies are desperately flailing around, trying and failing to make contact with each other. On top of its myriad of problems, 7 is also buggy, or at least seems like it most of the time. It can be as small as a hint on a loading screen spoiling a plot point, or as big as Teriel getting glued to the floor and the controls freezing when you try and throw a grenade. There's something called Sense Mode that's used to discover interactable objects, follow wires and disable security cameras, and detect enemies. Theoretically, this helps guide you away from enemies and towards objects of interest, but it too feels buggy, whether it really is or not. This mode controls with a third-person camera, but there's no way to rotate the camera. Whatever angle it was at when you engage this mode is where it's stuck, hiding enemies and wires behind walls or other objects. You have to constantly go in and out of sense mode just to rotate the camera, follow a wire or enemy to where it disappears behind a wall again, go back out of sense mode, back into it, spin the camera, on and on and on. It's a needlessly fiddly system that makes using the mode a chore, and you won't ever use it unless you absolutely have to. Another mechanic of questionable use is the map. It's far too vague to be useful. Almost all the areas in the game have multiple levels and floors, but the map doesn't tell you what level your objective is on. You can't even use the markers to indicate a general direction, as they often feel like they're several hundred feet away from where they are in the world. The parkour system is well implemented at least. This is an open-world game, and each area is big and sprawling, allowing for plenty of paths to tackle your objective or to just get around. That turns out to be a big deal. Peh, yes, that's really what it's called, is split into different zones, and you have to collect visas to access different areas. You'd think the game would be super restrictive because of this, and in some ways it is, but you are allowed to break those restrictions. For a start, you don't gain XP as you traditionally would by completing quests and defeating enemies. Instead, you improve your stats by collecting skill chips, which can be freely collected at set points throughout the world, encouraging you to explore. You can also pick up visas by exploring too. However, you can circumvent these visas and even the difficulty curve by using your thieving skills to sneak in and out of other zones. It never feels like 7 is forcing you towards anything. You can do anything at any time, whether you're leveled up enough, whether you have the right equipment, or whether you're overpowered. It's easy to stumble into side quests that are massively above your level, but you can still try them if you want. However, because quests don't reward you with XP, you never feel the need to do any of the side quests. The story and characters are all dull, so you won't be compelled to see what happens next either. And since you can complete the game with the basic equipment, assuming you find the right skill chips, you're not going to worry about gathering loot either. It's kind of amazing how desperately the game wants you to explore its world and its characters, yet undermines itself at every turn. The only thing 7 The Long Gone Days has going for it is the real-time stealth gameplay, a rarity in a CRPG, and its emphasis on player choice and freedom. It bungles both of them so thoroughly though that none of it matters. Even then, it still doesn't feel like the game is trying anything new or put a twist on classic tropes. It's just doing what everyone else in the genre is doing, only not as good. This is the kind of game that'll be called a classic by people who have never played Shadowrun Hong Kong, System Shock 2, Fallout New Vegas, or even Dex. It trades in cliched story beats and awful gameplay, and just isn't worth your time.